The year was 1891. A man from the Historical Society stood inside a hole in the ground on the Nebraska prairie, holding a thermometer. Outside, the January wind cut across the grass at 40 miles an hour. The temperature above ground was 11 degrees Fahrenheit. The thermometer in his hand read 52. He wrote in his notebook for a long time without speaking. Then he looked up at the earthen walls around him, packed sod and clay, smooth as river stone, still holding after 13 years. And he wrote one more line, exactly as recorded. He had come looking for a curiosity, a footnote, a story about a strange woman who had lived underground like an animal and died there. What he found instead was a system, precise, deliberate, and so far ahead of its time that he spent the rest of his career trying to explain it to people who didn't want to believe him. But here is what he never found. The one thing that his notebooks and measurements and official reports never answered. The letter, not the circular that went to 12 county papers in 1883, not the deed filed with the county clerk. The other letter, the one written years before any of this began, by a woman who had never met the girl she was writing about, and yet had known somehow that she was coming. That letter had been opened by someone else first, read by someone else, and then made to disappear, as if the words inside had never existed. The man from the Historical Society never learned who opened it. But we know. The night it all began was in the autumn of 1878. Inside a chapel tent on the edge of Red Willow Crossing, Nebraska, 30 people sat on wooden benches under lantern light. The tent smelled of tallow and damp wool, and the particular sourness of people who had come not to worship, but to witness. Reverend Doyle stood at the front with a legal notice in his hands. He was a tall man with a long face and the kind of careful voice that sounds like kindness and means something else entirely. He had been the mission reverend for 19 years. He knew how to hold a room. He knew how to make a silence work for him. He let this one go on for a full 10 seconds before he spoke. "Well," he said, "Ada Morrow. She was sitting in the last row, 15 years old, brown dress, too short at the wrists, a man's coat cut down to fit her, the elbows worn through. She had one bag, a flour sack, tied at the top, and inside it were everything she owned. 2 dresses, 3 books she had taken from the mission's discard barrel, and $1.32 wrapped in a handkerchief. She had been passed around since she was 7 years old. 3 months with Uncle Reuben, who sold her mother's quilt for whiskey money. 5 months with the tanners outside Columbus, who needed hands for washing, and not a girl who asked questions. 8 weeks with a widow who called her reading by candlelight disturbing and wasteful. 2 years in the mission dormitory with its iron cots and its rule about keeping everything tied up so you could move fast when they told you to move. She had learned to expect nothing. She had learned to keep her belongings portable. She had learned to read fast and remember everything, because books could be taken away. But what was already in your head could not. She had not learned to stop hoping, which had been, depending on the day, either her greatest flaw or her only real protection. Reverend Doyle looked at her the way you look at something you've already decided to throw away. "Your aunt," he said, "has left you her land claim." He paused to let that land. 160 acres of open Nebraska prairie. No cabin, no barn, no water. No trees within 100 miles. Someone in the middle rows laughed first, then 2 more. Then the whole room opened up. Not polite laughter, not the kind people swallow behind their hands. the full, ugly sound of people who have decided you are worthless and are delighted to have proof. Reverend Doyle pressed his thin lips together. Everyone in this territory, he said, loud enough to carry over the noise, called your Aunt Ruth Morrow a madwoman. She spent 26 years alone on that land, digging holes in the ground like a creature. She died walking to town in a sleep storm. She died alone. He folded the legal notice, and now she has left her hole in the ground to you. He looked at Ada one last time. I expect you'll want to see your inheritance for yourself. Ada stood up. She picked up her flour sack. She walked out of the chapel tent. She did not look back at any of them, but she heard Reverend Doyle's voice behind her, clear and deliberate, before the tent flap closed. A hole in the ground, he said, and nobody to blame but blood. The freight wagon dropped her 8 miles out. The driver said it was as far as he went. She walked the rest. The road disappeared after 3 miles. 2-wheel ruts swallowed by grass. Then nothing. Just open country rolling toward a horizon that never seemed to get closer. The wind came in from the northwest and hit her full in the face, and she put her head down and kept moving. She had 12 miles to walk. She passed through Red Willow Crossing once more on her way. The only road went through town. And that was where she saw the boy. He was standing at the gate of the mission yard, 8 years old, maybe 9, small for his age. Brown hair, worn boots, a canvas bag at his feet that was even smaller than her flour sack. A woman Ada didn't recognize was closing the mission gate from the inside, not looking at him. Ada stopped. "Where are you going?" she asked him. He looked up. His eyes were gray and very steady for a child standing alone outside a locked gate. "I don't know," he said. Ada looked at the closed gate, then at the boy. "What's your name?" "Everett." She picked up her flour sack. "Come with me," she said. She didn't explain where. She didn't promise anything. She just started walking, and after a moment, she heard his boots on the road behind her. They found the claim as the sun was going down. Ada stopped at the edge of it and stood very still. There was no cabin. There was no barn. There was a broken freight wagon tilted on one wheel, its canvas rotted to strips that let in the sky, and beside it, half collapsed, grown over with grass at the edges, was a trench, long and wide and deep, the earth around it crumbling where it had given way. It looked like something that had tried to become a house and failed. "This is it?" Everett said. "This is it." She walked to the wagon first. The boards creaked under her hands. Mouse droppings, rotted canvas, the smell of old wood and rust. But at the back, wedged into the corner and covered with a board, she found a trunk, iron-bound, heavy. She pried it open with a stick and looked inside. Tools, a bent square, a rusted draw knife, survey stakes, and beneath them, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with leather cord, a stack of thin books. 17 of them, stitched by hand. She lifted the first one and opened it. The handwriting was small and precise and slanted slightly to the left, the way her own handwriting slanted. Wind observations, spring 1863, R. Morrow. Ada turned to the next page, and the next. Her hands moved slowly, the way hands move when they know they are touching something important. Then Everett made a sound behind her. She turned. He had found the dog. It was lying on its side near the base of the wagon wheel, thin, gray-muzzled, ribs visible through its coat. Its tail moved once when Everett crouched beside it. Just once. "It's still alive," Everett said. He looked up at Ada. His voice was very careful, the way children's voices get when they are asking for something they are afraid to ask for. "Can we keep it?" Ada looked at the dog. She looked at the boy. She looked at the collapsed trench and the rotted wagon and the 160 acres of open prairie stretching away in every direction. "Yes," she said. She went back to the trunks. Beneath the oilcloth wrapping, beneath the last notebook, her fingers found something else. A paper envelope, the kind used for letters. Already opened. The seal broken. The flap folded back. She turned it over and read the address on the front. Mission at Red Willow Crossing. Attention, Reverend H. Doyle. Inside, the envelope was empty. She stared at it for a long time. Ruth Morrow had written a letter to Reverend Doyle. Someone had opened it. Someone had read whatever Ruth had written, and then removed every word. She set the envelope aside. She would think about it later. She had other things to do first. She opened notebook number 1 again, this time to the very first page. Ruth had written a date at the top. Just a date, nothing more. Ada read it twice before she understood. It was the year Ada was born. "Someone will need this someday," Ruth had written below it. "I will make sure they find their way here." Outside, Everett was feeding the dog the last of the hard biscuit from Ada's flour sack. The dog ate slowly, carefully, like an animal that had learned not to expect too much. Ada looked at the date again, then at the notebook in her hands, then at the open Nebraska sky through the gap where the wagon canvas had rotted away. "Build low," Notebook 15 had said. "The earth never lies." She didn't know yet what the empty envelope meant. She didn't know yet what had been in it, or who had taken the words away, or why. But she knew this much. Ruth Morrow had been waiting for her, and whatever came next, the cold, the work, the people who had already decided she would fail, she would not face it the same way her aunt had. She would not face it alone. The first night, Ada didn't sleep. She lay on the earthen floor of the collapsed trench with her coat pulled over her and Everett pressed against her side, and Stub. She had started calling the dog Stub because his tail was docked to almost nothing, curled at their feet. The wind came across the open prairie in long rolling waves, and the walls of the trench, where they still stood, caught it and sent it howling overhead. She listened to it and thought about Ruth's notebooks. She had read 4 of them by candlelight before the stub of wax burned out. Ruth had started with the wind, where it came from in each season, where it scoured the ground bare, where it piled snow into drifts that could bury a standing man. She had sketched the land with small arrows showing how water moved after rain, where it pooled, where it drained away. She had measured temperatures. She had recorded the depth of frost in January, and below the frost, how warm the earth stayed 2 feet down, 3 feet down, 6 feet down. Below 6 feet, Ruth had written in Notebook 3, the temperature holds between 50 and 55 degrees Fahrenheit, regardless of surface conditions. The earth remembers summer. It does not forget. Ida lay in the dark and said that to herself 3 times. The earth remembers summer. In the morning, she started digging. The ground was harder than she expected. She had 1 spade, borrowed from the mission supply shed the morning she left, returned in theory, but somehow still in her hand when she walked out. The blade was dull along one edge. Her palms blistered on the first day, bled on the second. By the 3rd day, the skin beneath the blisters had worn through entirely, and she wrapped her hands in strips torn from her second dress and kept going. Everett watched the first morning. By afternoon, he had picked up a flat piece of board from the wagon wreck and was using it to haul loose dirt away from the trench edge, piling it in a low berm to the north, the way Ruth's notebook said, "Pile your spoil where it will work for you, not against you. A berm to the north catches drifting snow before it buries your entry." He didn't ask her to explain. He had read over her shoulder the night before. He just did it. Stubb lay at the edge of the trench and watched them both. His ears moved at every sound. His ribs were still visible through his coat, but he was eating, prairie dogs mostly, which he caught with a patience that seemed to embarrass the prairie dogs themselves. And the gray around his muzzle made him look wise rather than old. On the fourth day, Mabel Gorse came. Ada heard the wagon before she saw it. She straightened up from the trench, her back aching in a way that had stopped being remarkable, and shaded her eyes against the October sun. Mabel Gorse was a heavy woman with a face set in permanent disapproval, the kind that had been there so long it had become the face's natural resting position. She ran the boarding house in Red Willow Crossing, and she ran most of the gossip, and she had known Ruth Morrow the way most people in the territory had known her. From a comfortable distance, with great confidence about everything Ruth was doing wrong. She stopped her wagon at the edge of Ada's claim. She did not get down. "Still at it, I see," she said. Ada didn't answer. She went back to digging. "Your aunt dug in that same spot," Mabel called out. "Spent 2 summers on it. You know what she ended up with? A hole full of water and a case of pneumonia she'd never fully recovered from." She paused. "This land has beaten better people than you, girl." Ada kept digging. "Doesn't it bother you?" Mabel's voice took on a different quality. Not cruelty exactly, but something adjacent to it. The sound of someone who genuinely wants to understand why you haven't given up yet, living in the dirt, like an animal. Ada stopped. She looked up at Mabel Gorse. "My aunt lived on this land for 26 years, she said. She understood it better than anyone in Red Willow Crossing. They called her crazy." She went back to digging. "I've noticed the people who get called crazy are usually just ahead of everyone else." Mabel Gorse made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Then she turned her wagon around and drove away. Everett waited until the wagon was out of sight. "She'll be back," he said. "I know," Ada said. "Keep hauling." The work settled into a rhythm after that first week. Ada dug in the mornings when her arms were fresh and the cold hadn't yet stiffened her shoulders. Everett hauled. They had developed a system without discussing it. She cut, he cleared. She stacked, he packed. She read the notebooks at night by candlelight, and he listened, lying on his back with his hands folded on his chest the way old men sleep, though he was 8 years old. The trench smelled of cut earth and roots, a smell Ada had not expected to like, and did. It was a clean smell, a deep smell, the smell of something undisturbed for a long time being open to the air. Some mornings she woke before Everett and lay still in the half-dark, listening to the prairie above her. The wind moved across the grass in long, slow waves. Meadowlarks called from somewhere to the south. Once, a coyote passed so close she could hear its feet in the dry grass, and Stubb lifted his gray head and watched the entry hole until the sound was gone, and then lay back down with the dignified composure of an animal who has assessed a situation and found it manageable. She began to understand what Ruth had meant about watching. The land was not blank. It was dense with information. The way the grass bent showed you the wind's direction and strength before you felt it on your face. The way water pooled after rain told you where the ground was low, where it was hard-packed, where it would stay soft longest into the cold season. The way certain plants grew clustered together in low spots told you where moisture collected underground. Ruth had spent 26 years learning to read all of it. Ada had been here 6 weeks, and she was beginning to understand the alphabet. Everett was learning it too, in his own way. One afternoon he appeared at the trench edge with a handful of prairie grass, different varieties mixed together, and asked Ada which ones Ruth had written about. They sat at the entry and went through Notebook 2 together, matching Ruth's careful pressed plant sketches to what Everett held in his hand: blue stem, switchgrass, buffalo grass. Everett repeated the names with the seriousness of a student memorizing something important, which he was. He found a piece of slate the size of a dinner plate at the base of the collapsed lean-to and carried it back without explaining why. Ada watched him sit at the trench entry that evening, using a nail to scratch letters into the slate. He had copied the first line of Ruth's Notebook 1, her handwriting still somewhat unsteady but legible. Wind observations, spring 1863. He held it up when he saw Ada watching. "For my lessons," he said. Ada looked at him. This boy who had arrived with a canvas bag smaller than her flour sack, who slept with it tucked behind his knees out of long habit, who had walked into the prairie with a stranger because a stranger had been the only one to stop, who was scratching dead women's words onto slate with a nail because he had decided that was worth doing. Her eyes went wrong for a moment in a way she didn't try to explain. "For your lessons," she said. Yes, the roof failed on the 8th day. Ada had followed Ruth's notebook diagrams exactly, or she thought she had. She had laid salvaged saplings across the trench and braced them with iron wheel rims from the wagon wreck. She had stacked sod blocks on top, grass side up, and packed earth into the gaps. It had looked right. It had felt solid when she pressed her hand against it. Then the first real wind came. She was inside when she heard it. A low moan that built to a howl, and then a sound she would never entirely forget. The crack of wood giving way, and the wet thud of sod falling. She scrambled up the sloped entry and out into the grass just in time to see half her roof collapse into the space where she'd been sitting. She stood in the wind with dirt in her hair and her heart hammering. Everett came running from where he'd been checking the rabbit snares. He stopped beside her and looked at the collapsed section without saying anything. Stubb sat down next to Everett and also looked at the collapsed section. "I followed the diagram," Ada said. She wasn't speaking to either of them. She was thinking out loud. She went back to the trunk and pulled out Notebook 7. She read Ruth's notes on roof failures slowly, once, twice, 3 times, until she found what she had missed. "Too proud by a foot," Ruth had written. "The pitch catches the wind like a sail. The wind lifts the edge, and the whole thing follows. Build lower than your pride tells you to. Build lower than looks right. The wind does not care how it looks." Ada sat back on her heels. She had built the roof the way it looked correct, not the way the notebook said. She had added 6 inches of pitch because it seemed more stable, more solid, more like a real roof over a real house. She had been wrong. She built it again. This time the saplings barely cleared her head when she stood in the center of the trench. She braced them tighter, layered the sod thicker, and rounded the edges packing dirt and cut grass into a slope that gave the wind nothing flat to catch. It took 4 days. Her hands, re-blistered and re-wrapped, had stopped hurting in any specific way and had settled into a general constant ache that she had begun to ignore the way you ignore a sound that never stops. When the next storm came, she was inside. She sat on her bedding platform with her back against the earthen wall and listened to the wind howl overhead. The wagon boards outside rattled. The collapsed lean-to she'd built for tool storage tore loose and scattered. But the trench was silent. Utterly, completely silent. The wind passed over her like water over a stone. She pressed her palm against the packed wall. 52 degrees. She started laughing, then crying, then both at once. Everett looked at her with the particular expression of a child who has decided to wait and see whether this is a good thing or a bad thing before reacting. Stubb thumped his docked tail against the earthen floor. "It's holding," Ada said. "The house is holding." Ruth had been right. The earth never lies. Clem Haskell arrived on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after Ada finished the roof. She saw his wagon from a distance, old and battered, pulled by a team that looked older and more battered, moving slow across the grass. The man on the seat had a white beard that reached his chest and hands she could see from 50 yards away, the size and shape of old root systems. He climbed down without announcing himself and walked to the edge of the trench and stood there looking at the roofline with his head tilted to one side. "You built this," he said. "Not a question." "I did." He walked along the edge, studying the angle. He crouched and ran his hand along the sod. He walked to the sloped entry, ducked his head inside, and stayed there for what felt like a full minute. When he came back out, he looked at Ada directly for the first time. "Clem Haskell," he said, "I hauled freight and supplies out to your aunt for years. Helped her test a roof beam once that failed and nearly killed us both." He looked at her roof. She had the theory right. The angle, the depth, the sod layering. But she couldn't build worth a damn. Joints too loose, beams too thin. She understood the prairie better than anyone I ever met. She just couldn't make her hands do what her mind knew. He glanced at Ada's hands, the wrapped palms, the calloused knuckles. "You've got both," he said. "The knowing and the stubbornness to make your hands learn." Ada didn't know what to say. No one had ever looked at what she was doing and seen anything other than foolishness. "I can show you a few things," Clem said. "How to lash a joint with rawhide so it holds twice what a nail holds. How to angle a vent so the smoke draws clean instead of backing up and choking you." He paused. "If you want." "I want," Ada said. He stayed 3 days that first visit. He showed her how to read the grain of a sapling so you knew where it would split under weight. He showed her the difference between sod cut in autumn, when the roots were tight and the moisture was right, and sod cut too early, which crumbled under pressure. He showed her how to wedge a weak joint so it carried more than it should, but he didn't make the decisions. He watched Ada make them. He corrected her angle once, her technique twice. The rest of the time he stood back and observed, in the way of someone who has spent a long life learning the difference between teaching and doing the work for someone. On the last morning, standing at his wagon, he said, "Build for the storm you haven't seen yet, because it's coming. It always is." Then he drove away. Ada watched him go. Then she picked up her spade. There was more to do. Miss Harriet Vane came in late October, when the first frost had silvered the grass. She was the county school teacher, sharp-eyed, composed, with the particular posture of a woman who had learned to take up exactly as much space as she needed, and not 1 inch less. She had heard about Ada's trench from one of her students and had come, she said, to see it for herself. Ada expected mockery. She got a thermometer. Miss Vane crouched at the edge of the trench and looked at the roof for a long time before climbing down the entry. She stood in the center of the space and breathed slowly. She pressed her palm against the earthen wall. She took out her thermometer and held it still for 2 full minutes. 52 degrees, she said, and the outside temperature is 19. Yes, Miss Vane looked at Ada. The ground below the frost line maintains a relatively constant temperature regardless of surface conditions. Basic geology, but most people don't think to use it. She looked at the walls, the roof angle, the vent placement. Your aunt understood something that almost no one else on this prairie was willing to consider. She spent 26 years proving it, Ada said, and you're finishing the proof. Miss Vane opened a small notebook, her own, neat and professional. Would you mind if I took measurements over the next several weeks? Temperature comparisons inside and outside. I'd like to document this properly. Credit Ruth Morrow, Ada said. She did the hard work. Miss Vane looked at her steadily. I'll credit you both. She came back every week. She measured. She sketched. She asked questions about the notebooks, about the building techniques, about what Ada had discovered on her own versus what Ruth had recorded. She never once used the word crazy in connection with Ruth Morrow, which made her, in Ada's experience, nearly unique in Red Willow Crossing. Everett began leaving a 3rd cup of water near the fire on the mornings Miss Vane was expected. Ada noticed, but didn't say anything. It was a Wednesday afternoon in early November when Warren Pruitt came. Ada was cutting sod blocks for the second shelter, a smaller trench, 14 feet by 8, that she planned to finish before the hard cold arrived. She heard boots on the frozen grass and looked up. Warren Pruitt was a broad man with small eyes that were always calculating something. He owned the freight depot in Red Willow Crossing and several of the claims around Ada's, and he had been trying to buy Ruth Morrow's quarter for years. When Ruth died without selling, he had assumed the land would revert to the territory. Instead, it had fallen to a 15-year-old girl with a flour sack and a borrowed spade. He stopped at the property line and looked at her work. Still playing in the dirt, he said. Ada kept cutting. You know this land was supposed to come to me, he said. Your aunt had no right to will it to anyone. She should have let it go back to the territory like a sensible woman. She wasn't sensible, Ada said. Neither am I. His face darkened slightly. You think you're clever, digging your holes and stacking your mud. But winter's coming, and dirt walls don't make you an owner. They just make you buried sooner. He looked at the trench for a long moment. When that thing collapses, and it will, I'll take this quarter for unpaid fees and arrears. Your aunt owed money all over this county. Ada stopped cutting. She turned to face him. Then pray for collapse, she said. Because that's the only way you'll own what I've built. He stared at her. Then he spat on the frozen ground, turned, and walked back to his wagon without another word. Ada watched him go. 3 days later, half her stockpiled roof saplings were gone. She couldn't prove who had taken them. She didn't need to. 2 weeks after that, a rider came from Red Willow Crossing with a document in a leather case. Warren Pruitt had filed a petition with the county court. Ada read it twice, standing outside the trench with the November wind cutting through her coat. The petition argued that Ruth Morrow had been of unsound mind when she filed her original homestead claim and when she wrote her will, evidence being 26 years of solitary habitation underground, behavior described in the document as consistent with severe mental derangement and an inability to manage property or personal affairs in a rational manner. If the court agreed, the will was invalid. The land reverted. Ada had 30 days to file a response. She had no lawyer. She had no money. She had $1.12 left from the $1.32 she'd started with. And Everett had no legal guardian, no paperwork, nothing tying him to Ada except the fact that she had said, "Come with me at a mission gate 2 months ago," and he had come. If she lost the land, she lost everything. If the court looked too closely at Everett's situation, they could send him back to the mission without asking her opinion at all. She stood in the wind with the petition in her hands and felt the first real tremor of fear. Not the cold, manageable fear of hard work and uncertain outcomes, but the deep, particular fear of a trap that has closed before you noticed you were in it. That night, she waited until Everett was asleep. Then she sat near the small stove with her hands around a tin cup and thought it through. If she surrendered the claim, Warren got the land, but Everett would be warm. The mission dormitory was cold and crowded and nobody's idea of a home, but it was a roof. It was food. It was safer than a sod trench in a Nebraska winter with a 15-year-old girl who was one bad storm away from losing everything anyway. If she fought and lost, she lost the land, and they took Everett too. If she fought and won, she still had to survive the winter. She still had to prove the court wrong. She still had to do all of this with no money, no lawyer, and a 30-day deadline. She sat with all of that for a long time. Stubb was asleep with his chin on Everett's ankles. His breathing was slow and even. Everett was on his side, one arm under his head, the canvas bag he'd arrived with tucked behind his knees the way he always slept, like he was still ready to move if someone told him to. Then Everett said something in his sleep. Not words, not quite. Just Ada. Look. She looked up. Through the vent hole in the roof, angled the way Clem had shown her, the way Ruth had recorded it, she could see a strip of night sky. The Milky Way ran through it like spilled flour. She stared at it for a long time. She reached for notebook 15 and opened it to the page she had read most often. Ruth's handwriting, careful and slanted and somehow familiar, even though Ada had never seen it before this autumn. "The earth holds," Ruth had written, "even when everything above it does not. Build low. Stay. The storm passes. The earth remains." Ada closed the notebook. She put the petition in the trunk under the oilcloth, next to the empty envelope with Reverend Doyle's name on it. She would deal with it, both of them, but not tonight. In the morning, she walked 12 miles to Red Willow Crossing and found Clem Haskell at the feed depot loading a wagon. She showed him the petition without explaining first. He read it slowly. His expression didn't change. When he finished, he folded it and handed it back. "Warren Pruitt," he said. "Yeah." He was quiet for a moment, looking at something past her shoulder. "I worked freight for that man 15 years back," he said, "before I knew what he was." He looked at her. "Your aunt had trouble with him long before she died. He tried to buy her quarter 3 times. The 3rd time, when she wouldn't sell, he came back with a paper, claimed it was a deed transfer she'd already signed." Ada went still. "She hadn't signed it," Clem said. "Her signature was on it, clear as anything, but she hadn't signed it. She came to me because she needed a witness. Someone who'd seen her refuse him. I saw her refuse him. 3 times. He reached into the breast pocket of his coat and produced a folded piece of paper, soft at the creases from years of folding and unfolding. I kept a copy of the original document, the one he tried to pass as legitimate, wrote down what I witnessed on the back of it the same day. He held it out to her. I never knew when I'd need it. Looks like now. Ada took it. She read it. Then she looked up at Clem. Why didn't you come forward when Ruth was alive? Because she asked me not to, he said simply. She said she'd rather outlast him than fight him. She nearly did. He picked up a harness he'd set down. She was right about most things. That was the one she got wrong. Ada folded the document carefully and put it inside her coat. This will stop the petition? Taken to the right person, it'll show the court Warren Pruitt has been trying to steal that land for years using fraudulent papers. That makes him the one with something to answer for, not Ruth. Clem looked at her. I'll go with you if you need a witness. She did need a witness. She said so. They went together to Miss Vane, who knew the county clerk and had 2 years of temperature records and could write a formal statement in language a judge would recognize. Miss Vane spent 2 evenings composing the response to the petition, citing geology, citing documented evidence, citing Ruth's meticulous notebooks as proof not of derangement, but of sustained and methodical scientific observation over 26 years. Ada signed her name at the bottom. Her handwriting slanted slightly to the left, the same direction as Ruth's. Everett had not been idle. While Ada was in town, he had reset all 3 rabbit snares and caught 2 rabbits and a prairie dog. He had hauled 6 loads of loose dirt to extend the north berm. He had found, at the base of the collapsed lean-to, a piece of gray slate about the size of a dinner plate, smooth and flat. He was sitting at the entry of the trench when Ada came back, using a nail to scratch letters into the slate. She watched him for a moment without saying anything. "What are you writing?" she asked. He held it up. He had scratched his own name across the top, Everett, in uneven but legible capitals. "Miss Vane said I should practice," he said. "She left a primer last week. I've been reading it." He looked at the slate. "I want to learn everything." Ada sat down next to him. She thought about a boy who had arrived with a canvas bag smaller than her flour sack, who slept with it tucked behind his knees like he expected to be told to move on, who had picked up a board on the first day and started hauling dirt without being asked, who set rabbit snares and counted stars through vent holes and practiced his name on slate with a nail because a school teacher had told him he should. "You will," she said. "We have time." Stubb came and lay down between them, his gray muzzle on Everett's knee. The sun was going down across the prairie, turning the grass copper and gold. From inside the trench, the temperature was 52 degrees. Outside, it was 23 and dropping. The court would rule within 30 days. Winter was coming. The real winter. The one the old-timers were already talking about in lowered voices at the feed depot. The one that had the creek running lower than anyone had seen in 20 years. But the petition was answered. The berm was higher. The second shelter was half dug, and Everett Morrow, he didn't have that name yet, but it was coming, was sitting in the last of the autumn light writing his name on a piece of slate. Ada looked at all of it. "Are we poor?" Everett asked. "Not sad. Just asking." Ada looked at the trench, the rounded sod roof, the north berm, the stacked blocks waiting for the second shelter, the 3 notebooks open beside the entry, weighted with stones so they didn't blow. "No," she said. "We are rich in what matters." Everett thought about this. "Okay," he said, and went back to his slate. The wind moved through the grass. The temperature dropped another degree. Somewhere to the northwest, clouds were building over the horizon, low and dark and moving fast. The earth held. The court ruling came on a Thursday. Ada was inside the main trench, fitting the last sod blocks into the wall of the secondary shelter, when she heard Everett's whistle, 2 short, 1 long, the signal they had worked out for a stranger coming across the claim. She set down the block, wiped her hands on her coat, and climbed the entry. The rider was a young man from the county clerk's office, 17 or 18, who looked cold and uncomfortable and eager to be done with this errand. He held out a sealed document without dismounting. Ada broke the seal and read it standing in the November wind. The original petition challenging Ruth Morrow's mental competency had been dismissed. Clem's document, the fraudulent deed transfer Warren Pruitt had tried to pass 15 years ago, had been submitted as evidence of bad faith. Warren's attorneys, however, had filed a counterclaim the same week, and in the meantime, pending final resolution of the underlying dispute, the court was granting Warren Pruitt temporary right of access to the northeast quarter of Ada's claim. She read that part twice. The northeast quarter was where the windbreak wall stood. The long sod wall she had built over 6 weeks, hauling and stacking and packing. The wall that ran 60 feet along the north edge of the trench entry and turned the killing wind before it could scour the ground bare in front of the door. The rider was already turning his horse. "When?" Ada called after him. "Access begins immediately," he said, and rode away. Warren Pruitt came the next morning. He brought 2 men with him, hired hands, broad-shouldered, carrying iron bars. They didn't look at Ada. They walked to the northeast corner of the windbreak wall and started pulling it apart. The sod blocks came down fast. 6 weeks of work. The berm Ada had extended and repacked and reinforced through October and into November, gone in less than an hour. Ada stood and watched. Stubb stood beside her, his body rigid, a sound coming from deep in his chest that wasn't quite a growl and wasn't quite anything else. He had never made that sound before. Warren Pruitt stood back from his men and watched Ada watching him. "Nothing personal," he said. "Court order." He was lying, and they both knew it. Then Everett came out of the secondary trench entry and saw the wall coming down. He didn't make a sound. He stood very still, the way he had stood at the mission gate the morning Ada found him. That particular stillness of a child who has learned that making noise doesn't help. One of the hired men walked past the pile of sod blocks, cutting across what was clearly Ada's property to reach the next section of wall. Stubb moved 3 steps forward and planted himself between the man and Ada. His lip pulled back. The man stopped. "Call your dog," he said. Ada looked at him for a long moment. "Stubb," she said quietly. Stubb didn't move immediately. He held his position for 3 full seconds, long enough for the man to understand it was a choice, not an order. And then he stepped back to Ida's side. The man walked past. The second section of wall came down. Warren Pruitt looked at Ada one more time before he left. His expression was not triumphant. It was something worse. The satisfied look of a man who has confirmed what he already believed. That she was alone. That she could be worn down. That it was only a matter of time. "The counterclaim will be ruled on within 60 days, he said. "I'd think carefully about what you want to do with those 60 days. He left. Ada stood at the place where the wall had been. The north wind came through the gap without resistance now, cold and direct, carrying the smell of something she had learned to recognize from Ruth's notebooks before she had ever felt it herself. Ice coming from a long way off. Everett was still standing at the trench entry. He was looking at the pile of sod blocks with an expression that was very controlled and very closed. Everett. He looked at her. Come help me start rebuilding. He was quiet for a moment. Then, he'll just knock it down again. Maybe, Ada said, but it's not built for him. It's built for us. Come on. He came. Stubbs sat at the edge of the demolition site for a long time, facing the direction Warren Pruitt had gone, before he followed. That night, Everett didn't speak at supper. He ate what Ada put in front of him. He washed his tin plate. He lay down on his bedding platform and faced the wall. Stubb walked in careful circles before settling against Everett's back, and Everett's hand came out without looking and rested on the dog's flank. He didn't talk the next morning either, or the morning after that. 3 days of silence. Not angry silence. The other kind. The kind Ada recognized from her own years at the mission, when something happened that was too large to talk about and you folded it into yourself and waited to see if it got smaller. It usually didn't. She didn't push him. She just kept working, kept talking to him as if he were answering, "Hand me that block. Watch this corner. The sod's too wet here. Try it from the other side." And waited. On the 4th morning, she woke before dawn to find Everett sitting near the stove with Stubb in his lap. The dog was too big for a lap, technically, but seemed to have no awareness of this. Everett had both arms around him and his face pressed into the dog's neck. Ada lay still and watched and didn't say anything. After a while, Everett said, muffled by Stubb's coat, "Is he going to be all right?" His leg. Stubb had been favoring his left foreleg since the day Warren's man had walked past him, not limping badly. "Just careful." "I think so," Ada said. "I've been watching it." Everett lifted his face. His eyes were dry, but very bright. "They didn't have to kick him," he said. "He wasn't doing anything." "No," Ada said. "He wasn't." A long pause. "Ada." His voice was smaller than usual. "What if the court says Warren gets the land?" She had been thinking about this for 3 days. She had an answer ready. Not a reassuring lie. Not a promise she couldn't keep. But the truth, as plainly as she could say it. "Then we figure out what comes next," she said. "The same way we figured out everything else." Everett thought about this. "Using the notebooks? Using everything we know," Ada said, which is more than it was 2 months ago. He nodded slowly. Then he put his face back in Stubb's neck for another minute. Stubb sighed. The long, settling sigh of a dog who understands his job and is doing it. Then Everett sat up, set Stubb aside, and said, "I'm going to check the snares." He pulled on his coat and went out. Ada watched him go. Then she opened Notebook 12. Ruth had recorded the signs in Notebook 12, not a list. Ruth never wrote in lists, always in paragraphs, as if she were composing letters to someone she expected to read them eventually. She had recorded what she observed in the bad years, the killing years, the winters that the territory still talked about in the careful way people talk about things that left scars. "The creek drops first," Ruth had written. 2 feet below the summer line by August means a hard winter. 3 feet means a killing one. In the bad years, the grass browns before it should. Not drought brown, but a different color, almost gray at the root, as if the plant knows what's coming and is pulling its strength underground early. Ada had checked the creek in August, 2.5 feet below the summer line. The birds change their patterns, Ruth continued. The geese go earlier. The meadowlarks stop singing 2 weeks before the cold comes in the hard years. In ordinary years, they sing until frost. Watch for when they stop. Ada had noticed the meadowlarks going quiet in the 3rd week of October. She had written it in her own notebook, the one she'd started keeping in September, smaller and less precise than Ruth's, but growing. And the barometric pressure drops fast, Ruth wrote, not slowly the way it does before a normal storm. Fast, in a matter of hours. If you have a barometer, watch it. If you don't, watch your dog. They know before we do. They always know. Ada looked at Stube. He had been pacing since yesterday morning. Not the easy, comfortable pacing of a dog who wants to go outside. Something different. He would walk the length of the trench, turn, walk back, stop at the entry, lift his nose, and then walk the length again. He hadn't eaten his supper the night before. She closed the notebook. She pulled on her coat. She went to town, 12 miles. She walked fast, the wind at her back for the first half and in her face for the second. The sky overhead the color Ruth had described in Notebook 12. Not the gray of ordinary winter storms, not white. Something between the two, a yellow-gray like an old bruise, a color that feels personal, as if the sky is deciding something about you specifically. She went to every house. She started at the edge of town and worked inward, knocking on every door. She didn't have a speech prepared. She just said what she knew. There's a big storm coming. Worse than usual. Your firewood won't be enough. Your walls won't hold the temperature. If you have somewhere underground, use it. If you don't, find someone who does. At the feed depot, old Clarence Birch listened to her with his arms crossed and his head tilted. "What makes you say that?" he asked. "My aunt recorded 3 winters like this one," Ada said. "The signs are the same. The creek level, the grass color, the birds stopping early, and the pressure is dropping fast. You can feel it in your ears if you know what to look for." "Animals don't predict weather," said the doctor, who had come in for supplies and was standing near the door. "No," Ada said. "They read it. There's a difference." She went to the boarding house. Mabel Gorse opened the door with an expression that suggested she had been expecting something irritating and was not disappointed. Ada told her the same thing she'd told everyone else. Mabel Gorse listened with her arms folded. "Your aunt," she said when Ada finished, "said the same kind of thing. Every winter for 26 years, apparently. And we survived every one of them just fine." "You survived ordinary winters," Ada said. "Ruth recorded 3 that weren't ordinary. You were lucky they didn't hit harder." She paused. "I'm not asking you to move underground. I'm asking you to prepare for something worse than usual." "What I'm not going to do," Mabel Gorse said, "is take storm advice from a 15-year-old girl who lives in a hole." She closed the door. Ada stood on the boarding house porch for a moment. The sky to the northwest had darkened in the last hour. Not dramatically, not in the way of a fast-moving thunderstorm, but steadily, the way a tide comes in. Slow enough that you didn't notice until you looked directly at it. She went to the chapel. Reverend Doyle was inside, writing at his desk. He looked up when she came in. "I've been to every house in town," Ada said. "I'm telling you the same thing I told them. There's a serious storm coming, worse than anything in the last 20 years. The signs are clear. Your mission tents won't hold the temperature. You need to prepare your people. Ada, Reverend Doyle said. His voice was gentle in the particular way of people who use gentleness as a wall. I appreciate your concern. Truly. But the weather is in God's hands, not in your aunt's notebooks. He set down his pen. You have been through a difficult autumn. The court case, the uncertainty. It would be natural to feel that danger is everywhere. Ada looked at him. She looked at the mission tents visible through the chapel window. Canvas walls, canvas roofs, no insulation, no earthen buffer between the people inside and whatever the sky chose to do. She thought about the empty envelope in her trunk, his name on the front, the words that had been inside it and were now gone. She didn't say any of that. God's hands, she said. Yes. She turned to go. I hope you're right. She heard him call after her as she pushed through the chapel door. Ada! She didn't stop. Outside, at the edge of the main road, she passed a group of young men standing near the feed depot. She recognized one of them, Hector Grange, 19, who had been at the chapel tent the night Reverend Doyle read the will. He had been one of the ones who laughed. Hey, he called out, Mole girl, you scared of sunshine? His friends laughed. Ada looked at the sky to the northwest. The color was deepening, that yellow-gray bruise spreading wider, taking up more of the horizon than it had an hour ago. She looked back at Hector Grange. She didn't say anything. She walked home. The storm came on a Friday night. It started with nothing. No dramatic shift, no sudden howl, just a stillness that fell over the prairie around sundown. The particular stillness that comes before something large. The meadow larks had stopped 2 weeks ago. Now even the wind stopped for about 20 minutes, and the silence was so complete that Ada could hear Everett breathing across the trench. Stubbs stood at the entry with every muscle in his body rigid. Then the wind came back, not gradually, all at once, as if a door had been opened somewhere to the north, and what came through it was not a storm, but the idea of storms. Everything cold had ever meant, concentrated and moving fast. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in 40 minutes. Ada knew because she had Ruth's thermometer hung at the entry and she checked it every half hour. -4, then -12, then -19. The sound was not howling. Ruth had tried to describe it in Notebook 12 and had crossed out 3 attempts before settling on this. Not wind, not any sound wind makes in ordinary circumstances. More like the sound of the world trying to come apart at a seam, a tearing, sustained, without pause. That was exactly right. Ada had prepared as much as she could. Extra sod packed against the secondary shelter walls. The food stores checked and reorganized. Dried rabbit, stored turnips, cornmeal, salt, 2 pounds of dried beans she had traded eggs for in October. Water melted from snow in the bucket near the stove and covered with a board to hold the heat. Extra fuel, dried dung, salvaged wood, the remains of the wagon boards, stacked inside the main trench. The earth around them held at 52 degrees. Outside, by midnight, it was 31 below. She sat with Everett near the small stove and listened to the storm try to find them. It couldn't. The rounded roof shed the snow instead of catching it. The low profile offered nothing for the wind to grip. She pressed her palm against the wall and felt the steadiness there. The slow, deep warmth of earth that had been holding heat since summer and was not willing to give it up for one storm, no matter how large. Read to me, Everett said. She picked up Notebook 3 and read aloud. Ruth's voice, in a way. Her careful observations, her failures and corrections, her slow accumulation of knowledge that nobody had wanted to hear. Everett fell asleep somewhere around the section on spring drainage patterns. Stubb moved from the entry to Everett's side and curled against him. Ada kept reading. The knock came the second night. She almost missed it. The storm was loud enough that individual sounds dissolved into the general roar. But Stubb heard it first. His head came up. His ears went forward. Then he stood and looked at the entry. And Ada looked at the entry. And then she heard it clearly. Someone was hitting the sod above the door. Not knocking. Hitting, with both hands, the way a person hits when they have lost the ability to be polite about it. She pulled on her coat. She climbed the entry. She had to push through 2 feet of drifted snow to break the surface, and the cold hit her face like something solid, immediate, and mean. The wind drove ice crystals into her eyes before she could blink. A shape emerged from the white. Reverend Doyle. He was carrying 2 children, one over each arm, wrapped in everything he'd had available, which wasn't enough. Their faces were gray. Their lips were past blue, and into something closer to the color of old pewter. He could barely stand. His coat was frozen rigid, and his beard was a solid mass of ice. He stopped when he saw Ada. They looked at each other across 3 feet of blowing snow. The man who had read her inheritance aloud to a laughing room, and the girl who had built the only warm place within 12 miles. "Please," he said. 1 word. The whole history of the autumn between them in 1 word. Ada looked at the children in his arms. "Bring them inside," she said. She took one of the children. She led him down the entry. She got them to the stove and began unwrapping layers of frozen cloth. Everett was already awake. He had been awake since Stubb stood up. And without being told, he was heating water in the tin pot and putting extra fuel on the stove. The children were mission kids. She recognized one of them, a girl called Nora, 8 years old, who had been at the mission dormitory since before Ada arrived there. The other was a boy she didn't know, younger, 4 or 5, with red hair and no shoes. Someone had put stockings on his feet over bare skin, and the stockings had frozen. She worked on the feet first, not rubbing. Ruth's notebook said, "Don't rub, the tissue tears." But warmth, slow warmth. Everett's warm hands cupped around the frozen stockings, while Ada heated water to the right temperature. Not hot. Warm. The way you'd warm a stone. Reverend Doyle sat on the earthen floor with his back against the wall. He hadn't said anything since, please. He was shaking. The full body shaking of someone whose core temperature has dropped past the point of choice. And Ada handed him a tin cup of hot water and told him to drink it slowly. He drank it. "How bad is the mission?" Ada asked. It took him a moment to find enough steadiness to answer. "The canvas is failing on the east dormitory. We got everyone into the chapel, but the chapel tent lost a pole in the first hour. We've been burning the pews." He looked at his hands. "We ran out of pews." Everett looked at Ada. She was already thinking about capacity. Main trench, 12 by 20, could hold 15 people tightly. Secondary shelter, 8 by 14, 7 or 8 more. The storage trench, smaller but insulated, 4 or 5 in an emergency. "Go back," she said to Reverend Doyle. "Bring everyone." He looked up. "You can't—" "I know how many people I can fit," Ada said. "Go. Bring them now, before the temperature drops further." He went. He came back 40 minutes later with 11 people. Mission children ranging from 6 to 14, two mothers who had been sheltering at the mission with their children, and an old farmer named Edgar Voss who had been passing through town when the storm hit, and had ended up in the chapel by accident. After that came the Hessler family, husband, wife, 4 children, the oldest 12, the youngest 2. Their roof had failed. They had seen the light from Ada's vent and followed it. Then Mabel Gorse. She came alone. No explanation. She stood at the entry of the main trench with snow coating every surface of her coat, and looked at Ada with an expression that was impossible to read, not humble, not grateful, not anything Ada had expected. Just present, just here. Ada stood back from the entry. "Come in," she said. "Get warm." Mabel Gorse came in. After her came 3 more families Ada barely knew, people from the edges of Red Willow Crossing who had lost fires or windows or roofs and had nowhere else to go. They came in 1s and 2s, following the traces of the ones before them. And last came Warren Pruitt. He came alone. No hired men, no documents. He was on foot, which told Ada his horses hadn't survived the first night. His hands were white at the fingertips, not from cold alone, but the specific white of tissue that has frozen and thawed and frozen again. He stood at the entry of the main trench and looked at Ada. He didn't say please. He didn't say anything. He looked at her hands and then at her face, and then somewhere past her shoulder, at the earthen wall, Ada held the entry open. "Come in," she said. "Get warm." He came in. She had 31 people in 3 trenches. She found Reverend Doyle an hour later, sitting on a low stool near the secondary shelter's stove. He was warming his hands around a cup of water. His color was coming back, slowly, unevenly, the way warmth returns to something that has been very cold. She sat down across from him. She had been carrying something since the moment she found his name on that envelope, and she had been waiting for the right time to set it down. She wasn't sure this was the right time. She wasn't sure there was a right time. She just knew that 31 people were in her trenches because of something she had built, and the man who had most tried to make her not build it was sitting across from her, alive. And she had a question. "The envelope," she said. He went very still. "In my aunt's trunk," Ada said. "It was addressed to you. It had been opened. It was empty." She watched his face. "Ruth wrote you a letter." A long pause. He reached inside his coat. The envelope he produced was not the empty one from the trunk. This one was sealed, had been sealed, the flap still holding its fold from years of careful storage. It was creased at the corners, soft from handling, but intact. He held it out to her. "I kept it," he said. "I opened the original. I read it. I took the letter out and kept it. I told myself I was going to destroy it, and then I couldn't." His voice was very quiet, almost inaudible under the sound of the storm overhead. "I've carried it for 7 years." Ada took the envelope. She turned it over. The seal was Ruth's. A small pressed circle in old wax, RM in the center. "She wrote it in 1871, Reverend Doyle said, when you were 8 years old. She had been watching the mission records. She knew your father had died, your mother had remarried, and she knew the placement situations were not. She knew you were being moved around." He stopped, pressed his lips together. "She wanted to take you in, to bring you to this land and teach you what she knew. She asked me to arrange it. She said she had been preparing for someone who would understand her work. She said she had started her notebooks the year you were born, the year Ada was born, the date on the first page of Notebook 1. I read the letter, Reverend Doyle said, and I made a decision. His hands were flat on his knees, very still. I told myself I was protecting you from a woman who lived underground and talked to wind and would raise a child to be as strange and as alone as herself. I told myself that. He looked at the earthen wall, but the truth was I was afraid of what she would make you into, of what questions you would ask when someone finally taught you to think. He exhaled slowly. I was right to be afraid. I was wrong about everything else. Ada held the sealed envelope, Ruth's handwriting on the front, faded but still legible. She thought about 8 years old. She thought about every placement, Uncle Reuben and the sold quilt, the Tanners and the washing, the widow who called her reading disturbing, the mission dormitory with the iron cots and the flour sack of belongings and the years of learning to keep everything tied up so she could move fast when they told her to move. Ruth had wanted her. Ruth had asked for her. And this man had buried the letter the same way the territory had tried to bury Ruth's notebooks, quietly, with good intentions as a reason and a long undeclared fear as the truth. Ada broke the seal. She read the letter by the light of the stove, slowly, in the middle of the worst storm the territory had seen in 20 years, with 31 people breathing in the earthen space around her. Ruth's handwriting, careful and slanted, and Ada had to stop once, briefly, because her vision went wrong in a way that took a moment to resolve. Exactly like her own. I have been keeping records since the day this child was born, Ruth wrote, not because I knew her. I did not know her. But I knew what she would need if she came to this land. I have been building a map for her. I have been waiting. Send her to me. I will teach her everything I know. I will make sure she is not alone. Ada folded the letter. She put it inside her coat, next to her heart, where she could feel the paper against her sternum. She looked at Reverend Doyle. I forgive you, she said, not because what you did was small. It wasn't small. It cost me 7 years. She held his gaze. But I will not live under what you buried. I have enough to carry. He nodded. Once, slowly. Then she stood up and went to check on the children. The storm screamed overhead. The earth held at 52 degrees, and somewhere in the main trench, Everett was sitting with Stubb pressed against his side, telling the Hessler children the names of all the stars visible through the vent hole, which tonight was none of them, but he knew them anyway. What he didn't say, what Ada understood later when she thought back on that night, was that he had been telling them the stars because the children were frightened, and frightened children need something specific to hold on to. Not comfort, which is vague, but information, which is solid. A name for a star is a solid thing. You can hold it. You can say it back to yourself in the dark. Ruth would have appreciated that. The first thing Ada did was count. 31 people. 3 shelters. She walked each space in the gray half-light of the storm's second morning, stepping over sleeping bodies, counting heads, assessing what she had and what she needed. Main trench, 15 people, including the mission children and Reverend Doyle. Secondary shelter, 9, including the Hessler family and Mabel Gorse. Storage trench, smallest and coldest of the 3. 7, the adults who had arrived last and taken what was left. Warren Pruitt among them, sitting with his back against the far wall and his white-tipped hands folded in his lap. 3 stoves. Enough fuel for 4 days if she rationed carefully. Enough food for 6 if she stretched it. Water from snow, which Everett had already begun collecting. packing it into the largest pots and setting them near the stoves to melt. A slow process that required constant attention and produced less water than you expected. She went back to the main trench and stood in the center and thought. Clem was sitting near the entry with his coat still on, watching her think. 12 degrees outside, he said, dropping. I know. Wind's backed around to the northwest. That means it's pulling from further north than last night. I know. She looked at the roof. How long? Clem was quiet for a moment. He had survived 4 bad winters on the Nebraska prairie. His estimate was worth more than a barometer right now. 3 days minimum, he said. Could be 5. Could be more. Ada nodded. She began organizing. She divided the work the way Ruth had divided her observations. By what needed doing, not by who was comfortable doing it. Everett and the 2 oldest Hessler children, a boy of 12 and a girl of 10, took responsibility for water. They worked in rotation, collecting snow from the entry, packing the pots, watching the melt, distributing the water in measured amounts. It was cold work and tedious work, and they did it without complaint, which told Ada something about what children were capable of when they understood the stakes were real. She put Clem in charge of the stoves, fuel rationing, temperature management, the small adjustments that kept the heat distributed evenly across 3 connected spaces. He moved slowly, his joints stiff in the cold, but his hands were precise. He knew fire the way he knew joinery, not as a skill, but as a language. The adults she organized by capacity. Those who were warm enough and capable enough went into rotation for snow collection and food preparation. Those who were injured or too cold, she kept near the stoves with specific, small tasks. Sorting dried beans, mending torn cloth, keeping the youngest children occupied. She gave Warren Pruitt the bean sorting. He took the tin bowl without a word and sat down and sorted beans. She moved through the 3 shelters every 30 minutes, checking temperatures, checking the youngest children, checking the entry tunnels for dangerous drift buildup. The storm made the checks difficult. Even the short passage between the main trench and the secondary shelter required pushing through accumulated snow, and the cold at the entries had intention in it. The kind of cold that finds the gap in your coat, the exposed inch of wrist, and works at it methodically. On one of her checks, she found a small girl, the Hessler youngest, 2 years old, a child called May, sitting in the corner of the secondary shelter with her eyes half closed and her skin the wrong temperature. Not cold. Hot. The distinct dry heat of fever rising fast. Ada put her hand on the child's forehead and held it there. She thought about Ruth's Notebook 9. She had read it twice in the autumn, the section on fever management in isolated conditions. Reduce the temperature, not raise it. Fluids, constant and small. Watch the breathing. If the breathing changes, shorter, faster, with a sound underneath it, that is the moment that matters. She looked at May's mother, a young woman named Clara Hessler, who was watching Ada's face with the focused terror of a parent who knows something is wrong and is trying to determine how wrong. She needs to be cooler, Ada said, not cold. Just cooler than she is. Take off the extra blanket. Give her water every 10 minutes. Small amounts. Don't let her gulp. She paused. I'm going to sit with her. You sleep. Clara Hessler shook her head. Sleep, Ada said again, quietly. I'll wake you if anything changes. You need to be rested to take care of her after I can't sit here anymore. Clara looked at her daughter. Then she lay down beside May, close enough to feel her heat, and closed her eyes. Ada sat. She sat with May Hessler for 4 hours. The child's fever climbed in the second hour, and Ada stripped the last blanket back and pressed a damp cloth, cool water from the melt pot, against the child's neck and wrists. May whimpered, but didn't wake. Her breathing stayed even, shallow, but even. In the third hour, the breathing changed. Just a slight shortening of the inhale, a catch at the top of it. Ada put her ear close and listened and heard what she was afraid of. A faint sound underneath the breath, thin as paper. She woke Clara Hessler. She woke Clem. She went back to Notebook 9 in her mind, reconstructing the passage she had read twice in October and not thought about since. In cases of lung fever in children, Ruth had written, "Steam is more useful than any other treatment available in isolated conditions. The moisture reduces the inflammation in the breathing passages. A tent of cloth over a pot of steaming water, with the child's face positioned above the steam, not so close as to burn, but close enough to breathe it, can ease the sound in the chest and bring the breathing back to an even pattern." Ada heated a pot. She found a piece of canvas from the storage trench. She built a small tent of it over May in the pot, holding it up herself, kneeling on the earthen floor with her arms aching. Clara Hessler crouched beside her, watching her daughter's face. The steam rose, the small tent filled with warmth and moisture. May's breathing hitched once, twice, and then the sound underneath it softened. Not gone, but softer. They kept it up for 30 minutes, reheating the pot twice. When they finally took the canvas away, May's breathing was even. Clara Hessler put her face in her hands. Ada sat back on her heels and felt the ache in her arms, and thought about Ruth spending 26 years writing things down for someone she had never met, who would need exactly this, in exactly this situation, 30 years later. She almost said something out loud. She stopped herself, but she thought it clearly. "I hear you." By the third day, the trench had its own particular life. People had arranged themselves into routines without being told to, the way people do when a space becomes home rather than emergency. The Hessler boy, whose name was Frank, had started teaching the mission children a card game using a battered deck he'd found in his coat pocket. The mission children, who had arrived gray-lipped and terrified, were now arguing about whether Frank had cheated on the last hand. Mabel Gorse had taken over the food distribution in the secondary shelter without asking anyone's permission. She ladled out portions with absolute fairness and zero sentimentality, which turned out to be exactly what the situation needed. Nobody argued with Mabel Gorse about portion sizes. Reverend Doyle had been reading to the youngest children in the main trench for 2 hours every afternoon. Whatever Ada had on hand, which was Ruth's Notebook 7 and Ada's 3 stolen books from the mission discard barrel, one of which was a natural history of North American birds that the children found inexplicably compelling. He read about birds in a voice shaped by 20 years of chapel sermons, which gave even a description of the yellow-billed magpie the weight of Scripture, and the children listened with the particular attention of people who have nothing else to do, and are discovering that birds are stranger than they thought. Nora, the 8-year-old Ada had recognized on the first night, began asking questions. Not polite questions. Real ones. Why does the ptarmigan turn white? Does it know the snow is coming? Or does it just change and then find out? Reverend Doyle answered as carefully as he could, which was not always well, but carefully. Ada watched him one afternoon from the passage between shelters. He was sitting on an overturned bucket with the natural history open in his lap. 3 children pressed against him on either side, the light from the stove making moving shadows on the earthen wall. He looked nothing like the man who had stood at a pulpit reading legal notices to a laughing room. She didn't say anything about it. There wasn't anything to say. Everett watched all of this. He watched the way he watched everything, quietly, from slightly outside it, missing nothing. He had his slate with him, and he was writing on it constantly, scratching words and then rubbing them out with his thumb and writing new ones. Ada sat beside him in the late afternoon of the 3rd day. "What are you writing?" He held up the slate. He had written 31 people, 3 shelters, day 3, all alive. She looked at it for a moment. "Keep writing," she said. On the 3rd night, Stubbs stopped eating. He had been eating since they came inside. Not much, but enough. The scraps from meals and the dried meat Ada rationed out as carefully as everything else. He had moved between the 3 shelters in a slow rotation, checking on people with the methodical thoroughness of someone who takes his responsibilities seriously. The mission children had learned his name, and he had learned which of them needed the most sitting with. And he distributed his time accordingly. But on the 3rd night, he lay down near Everett and put his gray muzzle on his paws, and wouldn't take the piece of dried rabbit Ada offered him. Everett noticed immediately. "He's not eating," Everett said. "I know." "Is it his leg?" Ada ran her hands along Stubbs' foreleg, feeling for heat, for swelling. The leg was stiff, but not inflamed. His gums were a reasonable color. His breathing was unlabored. "I think he's tired," Ada said. "He's been working very hard." Everett looked at the dog. "Stubb," he said. Stubbs' tail thumped once against the floor. Just once. Everett lay down beside him. Not around him, but beside him. On the same level. The way you lie down beside someone who is tired and needs company more than comfort. He put one arm over the dog's back. Stubb exhaled. The long, slow exhale of a dog who has finally stopped doing his job for 5 minutes. They lay like that in the firelight. Everett's eyes were open, watching the shadows on the earthen wall. After a while, he said, "Stubb guarded what nobody else thought was worth guarding." Ada looked at him. "The claim," Everett said, "before anyone else came." He stood there, and he said it with his whole body, that it mattered. Ada didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say to that. Mabel Gorse was sitting on the other side of the stove. Ada had thought she was asleep. She wasn't. She was watching Everett and the dog with an expression that was not her usual expression. Not approving, not disapproving, not calculating. Just present. She reached into her coat pocket. She produced a piece of dried beef, the good kind, from her own stores, which she had contributed to the communal supply and rationed as strictly for herself as for anyone else. She held it across the stove toward Everett. "For the dog," she said. Everett took it carefully. He held it under Stubbs' nose. Stubbs sniffed it. He lifted his head slightly. He took it from Everett's fingers with the deliberate gentleness of an old animal who has learned to be careful with the things that are offered to him. Mabel Gorse looked at Ada. "I owe you an apology," she said, not loudly, not publicly, quietly, across a stove, at night, when most people were asleep. Not just for this week, for all of it. Ada held her gaze. "I know it," Ada said. "I called your aunt. I know what you called her." Ada paused, and I know that she was strange by most standards. She was solitary and difficult, and she didn't explain herself to people who hadn't earned the explanation. She looked at Stubb, who was chewing his dried beef with eyes half closed. "I've been told I'm the same way." The corner of Mabel Gorse's mouth moved in a direction that was almost a smile. "You are," she said, considerably. They sat in the firelight on either side of the stove, with 30 feet of earthen wall between them and the worst storm in 20 years. "Your boarding house roof," Ada said after a while. "When the storm passes, I can show you how to reinforce it. The principle is the same. Low profile, rounded edges, no flat surface for the wind to catch. You don't have to go underground. But there are things you can do." Mabel Gorse looked at her for a long moment. "I expect," she said. "I should have asked you that 3 months ago." "Yes," Ada said. "You should have." The miracle happened on the 55th night. Ada had stopped counting nights after the 40th and then started again because Everett kept count on his slate, and it seemed important to him. A woman named Beatrice Aldrich, who had arrived on the second night with her husband and whose husband had a frostbitten hand that Ada had been monitoring daily, went into labor at roughly 2 in the morning. Ada knew what to do. She had read Notebook 9. She organized the space with the calm efficiency she had applied to everything in the past 3 weeks. Moved people, heated water, arranged what light there was. Clem took the children to the secondary shelter and told them a very long story about a mule he had once known in Kansas, a story that appeared to have no ending and didn't need one. 2 hours and 40 minutes later, in the deepest part of the earth, under 52 degrees of borrowed warmth, a child was born. A girl. She came out screaming, the particular outraged scream of a person who has been moved from one situation to another without being consulted. And Ada wrapped her in the warmest cloth available and put her in her mother's arms. Beatrice Aldrich looked at her daughter for a long time without speaking. "Hope," she said finally. "We'll call her Hope." In the secondary shelter, Everett heard this through the earthen wall. He wrote it on his slate. Hope. Day 55. Born underground. Storm still going. All alive. May Hessler's fever broke on the morning of the 58th day. Ada had checked her every 4 hours since the crisis on the 3rd night. The fever had gone up and down in a pattern that Ruth's notebook described accurately. 2 days high, 1 day lower, 2 days high again. And Ada had followed the notebook's guidance each time, steam and cool cloths and small amounts of water and watching the breathing above everything else. On the morning of the 58th day, she put her hand on May's forehead and felt what she had been waiting for. Cool, normal. The heat gone, as if it had never been there. May opened her eyes. She looked at Ada. "I'm hungry," she said. Clara Hessler, who had not slept more than 3 hours at a stretch in 2 weeks, put her face against her daughter's hair and stayed there for a long time. Ada walked to the entry of the main trench. She climbed up through the drift and broke the surface and stood in the open air for the first time in nearly 2 months. The storm was still going. Not at its worst. The killing intensity of the first 2 weeks had softened into something steadier, lower, a sustained assault rather than an active one. But the wind was still there, and the cold was still there, and the sky was still the color of old bruises. She stood in it and let the cold hit her face. Her hands were shaking from something that had been held very tightly for a very long time, and was only now, in a private moment on the surface of a storm-battered prairie, beginning to release. She breathed. May was alive. Hope was alive. 31 people in 3 earthen rooms under 52 degrees of borrowed warmth, were alive. The earth had held. She stood there until she stopped shaking. Then she went back down. It was Everett who noticed the change in the storm first. He had been watching the vent on the main trench roof for days. The small, angled hole that let smoke out and brought a thin thread of outside air in. He had learned to read it the way Ada had learned to read the barometer in Ruth's notebook. The quality of the air coming through, the behavior of the smoke going out, the sound of the wind at the angle. On the morning of the 61st day, he came to Ada and said, "Something's different." She looked at him. "The wind changed direction," he said. "It was northwest for weeks. Now it's coming from the west, and the smoke is going out straight instead of angling." Ada went to the vent and stood underneath it and felt the air coming through. He was right. Still cold, but no longer searching. The kind of cold that means a storm is ending rather than a storm that means to stay. She looked at Everett. He was watching her face with that steady, gray-eyed attention, waiting. "2 more days," she said. "Maybe 3. He nodded. He went back to his slate. Ada sat down with Ruth's notebook 12. The storm notebook, the one she had read more than any other in the past 2 months, and turned to the last entry Ruth had made. After the worst storms, Ruth had written, "The land looks ruined. The drifts are wrong. The landmarks are buried. The familiar shapes of the ground are gone. It takes a season for it to come back. Sometimes 2. But it does come back. The earth remembers what it was. It goes back to it, the way water finds its level. The bad years leave marks. They always do. But they do not change what the land is underneath. Neither do the bad years change what we are. Build low. Stay. The storm passes. The earth remains." Ada closed the notebook. She looked at Everett's slate, propped against the earthen wall. 31 people. 3 shelters. Day 61. Storm ending. All alive. All alive. She put the notebook back in its place and stood up and went to check on the children. Act 5. Resolution and Legacy. Nebraska, Spring 1881 to September 1905. The storm ended on a Thursday. It didn't end dramatically. There was no final gust, no climactic moment where the wind stopped and the sun came out and everything was resolved. It just thinned. The sound overhead diminished by degrees, the way a fever breaks, gradually and then all at once. And on the morning of the 63rd day, Ada climbed the entry tunnel and broke the surface and stood in still air for the first time in 9 weeks. The prairie was unrecognizable. The drifts had reshaped everything. Hills where the ground had been flat, valleys where structures had stood. The road into Red Willow Crossing had disappeared entirely under 8 feet of packed snow. 3 of the visible homestead roof lines to the east were partially collapsed, dark gaps in white surfaces. 1 was gone completely. She stood very still and looked at all of it. Then she went back down and told everyone the storm was over. They came out slowly, one by one, blinking in the flat white light like people emerging from a long sleep. The Hessler children ran immediately into the nearest drift and sank to their waists and had to be pulled out by Frank, who was 12, and therefore responsible, and therefore also immediately sank into the next drift. May Hessler walked out on her own feet, holding her mother's hand, and looked at the transformed landscape with the calm interest of a child who has recently survived something large and found the world on the other side of it interesting rather than frightening. Hope Aldrich, 9 weeks old and already loud about her opinions, was carried out in her mother's arms, wrapped in everything soft that remained. She squinted at the winter light and was not impressed. Everett came out last, after Ada, and stood beside her, with his slate under his arm. He looked at the changed landscape for a long time. "It looks different," he said. "Ruth wrote about that," Ada said. "She said it takes a season to come back. Sometimes two. But it does come back." "Yes." He nodded, as if this confirmed something he had already decided. The reckoning came in pieces, not all at once. Ada organized the able-bodied adults into work parties, clearing entries, checking structures, assessing what had survived and what hadn't. She directed the work with Ruth's notebooks open in her mind, pointing out where drifts could be used rather than fought, where the snow's own weight had created problems that required specific solutions. She was 15 years old, and she was telling grown men where to dig, and they dug where she told them. Nobody remarked on this. There wasn't time to remark on it. And besides, she was right about where to dig. Reverend Doyle organized the mission children into a line and walked them back to Red Willow Crossing, through the path the men had cleared. At the edge of Ada's claim, he stopped and turned back. Ada was standing near the main trench entry, watching them go. He walked back to her. He stood in front of her, and he didn't say anything for a moment. The careful silence of someone choosing words with more precision than usual. "I would like to speak at the next town meeting," he said, "about what you built here, what it did, what your aunt's work made possible." He paused. "With your permission." Ada looked at him. "Credit Ruth Morrow," she said. "By name, all of it." "By name," he said. "All of it." He walked back to his line of children and led them toward town. Mabel Gorse left without ceremony. She came to Ada on the morning of the second day after the storm, when the path to town was passable, and stood in front of her with her coat buttoned and her expression set back to its usual configuration. Not warm, not soft, but no longer pinched in the particular way it had been before the storm. She held out a key. "My storage shed," Mabel said. "Behind the boarding house. It's full of preserved food, beans, cornmeal, salt pork, dried fruit. I've been storing for 10 years. There's more in there than I'll need before spring." She pressed the key into Ada's hand. "Use what you need." Ada looked at the key. "Why?" she asked. "Because you fed my people when I couldn't," Mabel said. "And because your aunt was right and I was wrong, and the least I can do is be useful about it." She walked away before Ada could respond. Ada looked at the key in her hand for a moment. Then she put it in her coat pocket. Aldous Crane was found on the 4th day. He had been an old man who lived alone on a claim 2 miles east, the one whose roof line Ada had seen collapsed in the first morning after the storm. She had known about him. She had knocked on his door the afternoon before the storm and told him what was coming and offered him a place in the trench. He had told her he had survived 50 Nebraska winters and didn't need advice from a girl who lived in a hole. They found him in his kitchen, in his chair, his hands in his lap. The stove had gone cold sometime in the first week. Ada stood outside his claim for a long time after they told her. She didn't feel satisfied. She didn't feel that anything had been proven or settled or resolved by Aldous Crane's death. She felt only the specific weight of a loss that didn't have to happen, the particular sadness of unnecessary things. He had been stubborn and proud and wrong, and he was dead, and none of those facts canceled out the others. She stayed until she had organized a party to bring him to town properly. She didn't let anyone rush that. Then she walked home. Warren Pruitt came on the 5th day. He came alone, on foot, which was still how he traveled. His horses had not survived the storm, a loss she would not have wished on anyone. He walked across the snow-packed ground with his hands in his pockets and stopped 10 feet from Ada. His fingertips were bandaged. The frostbite had been worse than it looked. He would keep the fingers, she had heard. All of them, though 2 would never have full feeling again. He looked at the trench, the secondary shelter, the rebuilt windbreak wall. She had already begun rebuilding it, pulling the sod blocks from the pile his men had made and restacking them, lower and tighter than before. He looked at all of it for a long time. I underestimated her, he said finally. Both of them. Ada waited. That was all he said. He didn't apologize. He didn't make an offer. He didn't explain himself or reframe what he had done, or suggest that the circumstances had been different from how they were. He just said what was true, that he had underestimated Ruth Morrow and Ada Morrow, and then he stood there as if waiting to see what would happen next. The counterclaim, Ada said. Your attorneys. My attorneys withdrew it last week, he said, when Haskell's evidence went before the district judge. The original petition was dismissed 2 years ago, and the counterclaim is gone now, too. He paused. The land is yours. It was always yours. He looked at the rebuilt wall. The northeast quarter, he said. The access order. I'll have it rescinded. Yes, Ada said. You will. A long silence. He turned and walked away. She watched him go. Across the packed snow, past the boundary of her claim, down the road toward town. He didn't look back. She watched until he was gone. Then she picked up a sod block and put it on the wall. Clem Haskell died on a Tuesday in April. Not from the storm. He had come through the storm better than most people 20 years younger, which he attributed to low expectations and a lifetime of sleeping in cold places. He died the way he had always seemed likely to die, quietly, on his own terms, in the shelter he had moved into the previous autumn without asking permission. Ada found him in the morning when he didn't answer her knock. He was in his chair with his coat on and his hands folded in his lap and his face relaxed in a way she had never seen when he was awake, as if he had finally set down something heavy he had been carrying for a long time. She sat beside him for a while before she did anything else. She thought about what he had said to her in October, standing at his wagon the first time he left. Build for the storm you haven't seen yet. Because it's coming. It always is. She thought about his hands correcting her angle on a vent hole, his voice saying too steep, "Wind will catch it." His expression the first time he had looked at her rebuilt roof and said nothing, which she had learned meant it was right. She thought about the afternoon he had told her about Ruth's roof failures. Joints too loose, beams too thin, the theory right and the execution wrong. And how he had said it without contempt, only sadness. The way you talk about someone you respected and couldn't save. She thought about his wife and son on the Platte Road, dead of cholera 30 years ago, a grief he had never stopped carrying and had never stopped mentioning, not because he was dramatic about it, but because he believed dead people deserved to be mentioned. He had said their names, Magda and little Henry, to Ada exactly once on an October afternoon while they were setting posts for the windbreak wall, speaking into the middle distance with the matter-of-fact tone of a man making an accounting. Then he had picked up the next post and driven it in with 3 clean blows, and that had been that. She hoped he had found them again, wherever people went. She was not certain she believed in the place people were supposed to go, but she thought if anyone had earned a reunion, Clem Haskell had. She buried him on the rise above the draw, where the wind blew clean and you could see the whole prairie in every direction. She dug the grave herself down to 4 feet until her arms ached and her hands remembered what blisters felt like. Everett helped with the last foot. They wrapped Clem in his own blankets and lowered him into the earth that had kept them all alive. Ada planted wild rose on the mound. The stubbornest plant on the prairie, Clem had told her once. The one that could root in soil so poor nothing else would grow. She thought he would appreciate the joke. Everett stood at the grave with his slate. He had already decided what to write. He had been thinking about it since the morning. He scratched the letters carefully into the smoothest piece of stone he could find. A flat piece of gray shale from the creek bed, carried 2 miles in his coat pocket because it was the right shape. He used the nail he always kept in his left pocket, the one he'd been practicing letters with since October. He taught her how to make it hold. He set the stone at the head of the grave and stepped back and looked at it. Ada stood beside him. "Is that right?" he asked. "That's exactly right," she said. The formal adoption papers were signed on a Wednesday in September 1883 in the county judge's office in Red Willow Crossing, with Miss Harriet Vane as witness. Ada was 20 years old. Everett was 13. Miss Vane had spent the previous 2 years helping Ada build a case, documenting the stability of her land claim, her management of the crisis winter, the formal recognition of her ownership by county deed. That demonstrated she was a fit and capable guardian. The judge was a dry, precise man named Whitmore, who asked his questions in a specific order and listened to the answers with the attention of someone who has learned that the difference between the right answer and the wrong one is usually in the details. He asked Everett if this was his wish. Everett said yes, without hesitation. "Does this mean I have a last name now?" he asked after the judge had finished writing. "It means you have a last name now," Judge Whitmore confirmed. Everett looked at Ada. "Morrow," Ada said. "If you want it, I want it," Everett said. Stubb was waiting outside the judge's office, tied to the post, because the judge had a policy about dogs that Ada had decided not to argue with. Everett went out and untied him and crouched down and let Stubb put his gray muzzle against his face. "Everett Morrow," he said to the dog. Stubb thumped his docked tail. Miss Vane walked out behind them and stood in the September sunlight and looked at them both. "Your aunt would have approved," she said to Ada, "of all of it." Ada looked at Everett and Stubb and the long road back to the claim and the prairie rolling away in every direction, golden in the autumn light, endless and ordinary and exactly what it was. "I know," she said. "I think she planned it." Stubb died on a morning in early spring, 1887. He died the way he had lived, on his own terms, without drama, in the place he had chosen. Ada found him at the entry of the main trench, lying on his side in the thin spring sunlight, his gray muzzle on his paws, his eyes closed. He had eaten his supper the night before. He had done his last walk through the shelters, checking the way he always checked, and then he had come here and lain down and let go. Everett was 17. He dug the grave himself, beside the main trench, under the wild rose Ada had planted the first autumn. He didn't ask for help. Ada watched from a distance and let him work. He buried Stubb wrapped in the old canvas coat Ada had worn the first winter, the man's coat cut down to fit, so worn now that the elbows were gone, but still the warmest thing on the claim. He made the stone himself. He had been making things with his hands for years by then. Clem's chisels had passed to him by way of Ada, and he had learned to use them with the same patient precision that Clem had used everything. He shaped the stone over 3 evenings, working by lantern light at the trench entry, and when he was done, he brought it to Ada before he set it. She read it. He guarded what others laughed at. She handed it back without saying anything. Her throat had done something that made words difficult. He set the stone. He stood at the grave for a long time. Then he came and sat beside Ada on the threshold of the main trench, and they watched the prairie together in the thin spring light, and neither of them said anything for a while. And that was the right thing. The years after moved the way years do when they are full. Miss Harriet Vane helped Ada publish the circular in the autumn of 1883. It went to 12 county papers and 2 agricultural bulletins. Letters came back from settlers, from farmers, from women in isolated situations who had read about the sod trench system and wanted to know more. Ada answered every one of them in her own hand, in the slanted left-leaning script that was identical to Ruth's. By 1890, 23 families in the county had built low-profile emergency shelters based on Ruth's principles. Not for everyday living. Most people still wanted their wooden houses and their visible pride. But for the bad winters, the ones that came without warning and killed the unprepared. Ada taught them herself. She walked from claim to claim in the first springs after the great storm, when the snow had melted and people were still rebuilding and still shocked by what the winter had done. And she showed them what Ruth had shown her through the notebooks: how to read sod, how to angle a vent, how to build a wall that gave the wind nothing to catch. She brought the notebooks with her and read from them when her own words ran out, which was not often, but sometimes. Some people listened. Some didn't. The ones who didn't, she noted without judgment. You could not make people accept safety any more than you could make them accept any other gift they hadn't decided they needed. You could only offer it and keep offering it and hope that one day the gap between what they believed and what they needed would become small enough to cross. Ruth had understood that. She had spent 26 years trying to teach a prairie that didn't want to be taught. Ada had learned from her example, the patience of it, the long unacknowledged labor of it, and tried to do it better. Roland Voss arrived in Red Willow Crossing the year after the storm as the new county school teacher. He walked out to the claim on his 3rd day in town, looked at the sod roof for a long time, and asked Ada to explain the ventilation system. She explained it. He listened carefully and asked good questions. He came back the following week and asked about the soil layering. He came the week after that with no stated reason at all. Everett noticed before Ada did. He didn't say anything directly. He just began leaving 2 cups of coffee near the entry on the mornings Roland was expected, the same way he had left a 3rd cup for Miss Vane 2 years earlier. Ada noticed. She didn't say anything either. Some things, she had learned, were best allowed to find their own level. They married in the spring of 1885. The ceremony was brief, in the main trench, which was the only building on the claim large enough to hold the guests, and the only place Ada had ever felt entirely at home. Everett stood at her side. Stubbs sat at Everett's feet and behaved with more dignity than several of the human guests. Mabel Gorse attended. She sat in the front and did not cry, but her handkerchief was not entirely dry when she put it away. Everett Morrow became a lawyer. He studied first with Miss Vane, who had more books than anyone else in the county, and a method of instruction that was demanding and precise and produced results. He read law through correspondence, passed his examination in 1895, and established a practice in Red Willow Crossing that specialized in property rights. Specifically, the property rights of women and orphaned children, cases the other lawyers in the county found unprofitable and therefore available. He used the precedent of Ada's land case in his first filing. He used it again in his third, his seventh, his 12th. It became a foundation he built on for 30 years. He also kept a notebook. Not like Ruth's. Not observations of wind and temperature and soil, but records of cases, of people, of the small and large injustices that came across his desk in a county that was still deciding what it believed about women and property and the right to stay somewhere you had built yourself. He wrote in the same slanted hand he had learned scratching Ruth's words onto gray slate with a nail. He wrote the way Ruth had written, not for the present, but for whoever would need it later. Ada's daughter, her name was Clara, born in 1886, grew up in a house half sunk in the prairie, with 17 notebooks stacked in a trunk, and a mother who could read the color of the sky the way other people read words. She became a naturalist. She published a book in 1901 based on Ruth's observations, a proper scientific text with diagrams and measurements and the kind of language that got read by people who made decisions about things. She credited Ruth Morrow on the title page and Ada Morrow in the dedication, and the book stayed in print for 20 years. Clara's daughter, the one Ada would sit with on September evenings on the threshold of the main trench, was born in 1896 and named Ruth. Not after pressure, not after suggestion. Just because Clara had grown up with the name filling the house the way warmth fills an earthen room, slowly and from all directions, until you forget there was ever a time before it. In the autumn of 1891, the man from the Historical Society stood in the main trench with his thermometer and his notebook and wrote down what he found. He wrote for a long time. When he was done, he climbed out of the trench and stood on the surface and looked at the bronze plaque the society had affixed to a post at the claim boundary. It read, "Built 1878. Ada Morrow, age 15. Based on the recorded work of Ruth Morrow, 1863 to 1878. On this prairie, the safest house is the one the wind cannot find." He stood and read it for a while. Then he wrote in his notebook, "The temperature inside the main trench is 52 degrees Fahrenheit. Outside temperature today, 14 degrees, exactly as recorded." He closed the notebook. The final scene happens on a September evening in 1905. Ada is 52 years old. She is sitting on the threshold of the main trench. The same threshold where Stubb used to lie in the mornings, where she and Everett sat after they buried him, where she has sat in 1,000 ordinary evenings watching the light change over the prairie. Her granddaughter is 9 years old. Her name is Ruth. She had not suggested the name. It had been Clara's idea, offered quietly and without explanation, the way the best decisions often are. Young Ruth sits beside her grandmother and looks at the prairie, the grass moving in the evening wind, the sky going copper and rose in the west, the stars beginning to show at the eastern edge. "Did you really live here?" she asks. "Underground?" "I did," Ada says. "Wasn't it scary?" Ada looks at the trench. the rounded sod roof, patched and rebuilt so many times over the years that it is more Ada than Ruth now, though the principle is entirely Ruth's. The entry, worn smooth at the edges from 30 years of hands and feet. The wild rose beside it, spreading wider each year, the roots running deep into the prairie in a way that no cold has ever reached. Every single day, she says. I was terrified every single day. Young Ruth considers this. But you stayed. The ground wasn't scared, Ada says. The ground held. So I held too. Young Ruth is quiet for a moment. Then, will you teach me? What Ruth taught you? Ada looks at her granddaughter, the slanted handwriting on her slate, the way she watches things before she talks about them, the way she asks questions that don't have easy answers and waits for real ones. I will teach you everything, Ada says, starting tomorrow. The sun goes down over the Nebraska prairie. The first star comes out in the east. The grass moves in the long evening wind, and underneath it, below the frost line, below the reach of any storm that has ever come across this land, the earth holds its temperature 52 degrees. The earth remembers summer. It does not forget. Later, when the stars are out fully and young Ruth has gone inside, Ada sits alone on the threshold for a little while longer. She presses her palm against the earthen wall the way she has pressed it 1,000 times, feeling for the temperature, for the steadiness, for the thing Ruth understood and tried to teach a world that wasn't ready to learn. The wall is 52 degrees. She thinks about Ruth, who spent 26 years alone getting this right so that someone else wouldn't have to learn it alone. She thinks about Clem, who spent 30 years carrying a piece of folded paper that he didn't know he would need until the moment he did. She thinks about Everett, 8 years old, standing at a locked gate with a canvas bag smaller than her flour sack, his gray eyes steady. She thinks, none of this was an accident. Ruth began her notebooks the year Ada was born. Clem kept his document for 15 years. The storm came the winter the trench was finally ready. The letter arrived, in Ada's hands, not Doyle's, at the exact moment it needed to arrive, in the exact place that would give it the most weight. She doesn't know if Ruth planned all of it. She suspects the answer is yes and no, that Ruth planned what she could plan and trusted the rest to the kind of logic that doesn't have a name but tends, in the end, to get things right. Build low, Ruth had written. The earth never lies. Ada has been building low for 27 years. The earth has not lied to her once. She sits there a little longer, her hand on the wall, feeling the steady warmth that comes from somewhere down below the frost, below the reach of any storm, where summer is still present in the soil like a promise that hasn't expired. Then she goes inside. She built it at 15 with bleeding hands and a borrowed spade and 17 notebooks written by a woman she had never met. She fed 31 people through 63 days of the worst winter in 20 years. She forgave what could be forgiven and let go of what couldn't. And she taught what she knew to everyone who came after her. And what she knew came from Ruth. And what Ruth knew came from 26 years of watching and listening and writing things down for someone who would need them. People like to say that knowledge is power. What they mean is that knowledge, shared freely and without condition, is the only thing that outlasts the person who holds it. Ruth Morrow knew this. She spent 26 years building a map she would never use herself. She spent 26 years writing letters to a girl she had never met and trusted, against all evidence, would someday arrive. Ada Morrow arrived. She built what Ruth had designed. She survived what Ruth had prepared her for. She taught what Ruth had taught her, and Clara taught it after her. And young Ruth is learning it now on September evenings on the threshold of a house that has been standing for 27 years because one woman decided to build low and trust the earth and wait. The earth never lies. And if you are sitting somewhere right now, in your own storm, in your own cold, with people who have laughed at what you're building, and a hole in the ground that doesn't look like much from the outside, remember her. Remember that she was 15 years old and alone and terrified. Remember that she had $1.32 and a borrowed spade and 17 notebooks she hadn't yet fully read. Remember that the people who laughed the loudest were the ones who came to her door in the dark, and that she opened it for every single one of them without asking them to earn it first. Build low. Stay. The storm passes. The earth remains.